Today I'm going to walk you through everything that you need to know if you want to make modern boom bap beats.
One time I get for more. Got me a new Mac.
So this is a video that's mainly inspired by Griselda. I really love their music, so I want to break down some of the things that you need to know if you want to make music like theirs. First, I'll quickly play the beat that I made here for the intro. Now, if you guys watched my prior video on how to make old school boom bap beats, I walked you guys through some of the core concepts when trying to make those types of beats. Here, when it comes to modern boom bap beats, there are a few things that differ and small little details that can really make a big difference. And I'm going to break these down into 4 different concepts. Let's go through each of these one by one. By the way, if you like my videos, please think about subscribing. If you ever get annoyed or bored of my videos, it's just one click away to unsubscribe. It really does help me out though. So first, let's start off with the BPM of these beats. Comparatively, these beats are a little bit slower than their old school counterparts. I find that the range typically falls in between 75 to 85 BPM. I think one of the reasons for this is that these beats typically have a little bit more happening in them. They aren't just one sample as well as drums and bass added on top and that's it. And since there is a bit more happening, there are more moving pieces, slowing down the beat to provide more room so all the sounds have space can be one of the reasons for this. But a slower BPM also does provide a more relaxed type of energy. In either case, a bit of a slower BPM is going to be ideal here. You will see I set the BPM of this beat to 80. Moving on, the next concept that we will look at is the sounds that are typically used. If I had to make an educated guess, I would say that these beats don't typically use actual samples like old school boom bap beats do. You'll remember in the old school boom bap video, I talked about how the cornerstone of a lot of those beats were samples, whether it was mainly jazz or soul. Here with these beats, this is an educated guess, but I don't believe they actually use samples. For legal reasons maybe, I'm not sure, but nonetheless the sounds within these beats sound like they're original, but they're made to sound like samples. Before we talk about how to get them to sound like samples, let's first talk about the sounds themselves. I often find with these beats, it's a mixture of acoustic and synthetic sounds. It seems like the acoustic sounds help introduce some throwback vintage feel into the beat, but the inclusion of synthetic sounds can provide a novel feel to these beats, something a bit more innovative and not the same old school types of textures that we're used to hearing. You can see in this beat, I used an acoustic bell here. You can see I went to the Bell's acoustic section in Omnisphere, and I chose this Glockenspiel preset. Now I did run this sound through some heavy processing, which again I will cover shortly, but this is how it would sound without any effects. Again, very acoustic sounding. But in this beat I also have some synthetic sounds in here, just as a way to introduce a layer of different sounding textures. The juxtaposition between the acoustic and the synthetic make for a really unique feel to these beats. Again, if I had to guess here, I would assume that hardware synths are typically being used, but since I don't have any, I just use a synth here that was meant to mimic a more retro synth, MS-20. Now in terms of the processing, if I were to take all these effects off of every single sound here, so there's a big difference here. These sounds don't feel anywhere near as grimy as I want them to. So some of the tools that you'll need to achieve this aesthetic are saturators and EQs mainly. The EQs will be used to really constrict the frequency so we don't have too many bright polished tones in our sounds. We want to cut those frequencies out to create a sense of dullness in the high end. And tape saturators are used to really push our sounds towards that older aesthetic. So here I'm using Reels. As many of you know if you watch my channel, I really like this plugin. We're using things like RC20 or Waves Cassette. These are comparable plugins that can really help you achieve this aesthetic. I would say though that I don't think iZotope Vinyl, which is another popular type of plugin like this, it's not really going to be able to achieve this type of aesthetic as well. I know it is popular, but in terms of creating some heavy saturation, iZotope Vinyl is a bit lacking in my opinion. I think that plugin is good for frequency restriction, but less so for actual tape emulation. Looking at the mixer, I also have some bit crushing and another emulation plugin here in case you're wondering what these are. These are also helpful tools that you can use. But I would say that EQ and saturators are going to be your best friends for this type of style. Now, one other technique that I really want to point out All these tools that we use are really great ways to get your sounds to feel like samples. But one small detail that you might overlook that can really get in the way of achieving this aesthetic is plugin modulation. If you guys remember my video on getting your stock plugins to sound more professional and just better overall, I pointed out that modulation is one of the means of achieving this. To quickly show you what I mean, if I go into Omnisphere and I take the sound here and I play the same note over and over again, this is a bit of an extreme example, but you can hear every time I play the exact same note the exact same way, the tonality of the sound changes. Now the reason this happens is because this modulation right here is occurring. And this can be a problem. If we want our textures to feel like samples, we need them to stay consistent as if we were actually sampling. If we were making a different style of beat, having our textures sound different throughout the entire beat might be something that's more useful to us. But with this particular aesthetic, since we are more pursuing the sample type of feel, this type of effect is going to end up hurting our beat. So whether you want to turn off all your modulations within your plugin, or you want to print out your sounds like I did here, this is going to help create some consistency so your sounds aren't changing throughout the entire beat. And this will help you create that sampled feel in your beat. It's a small little detail, but it can make a really big difference depending on the sounds that you're using. The next concept that we're going to look at is the bass. This is somewhat similar to the typical boom bap type of beat. These beats mainly rely on acoustic sounding basses instead of synthy ones or 808s. Having said that, many of these samples in those old school boom bap beats rely on jazz samples, in which upright basses are commonly used. With these more modern boom bap beats, regular general basses are more common, so for this beat I just used a regular fingered bass preset for this bass line. And it felt like it matched the aesthetic pretty well. And finally, the last concept that we will cover, another really important one, is the drums. This again does share similarities with the old school boom bap types of beats, but there are smaller details that will have a large impact here as well. Starting off, the drums that we choose are going to be similar to the old school type of beats, in that using drum breaks will be the best means of getting that right aesthetic. One of my viewers actually told me about these drums by Beat Batter. They sell really good sounding drum breaks that actually sound like they came from old vinyl records. They didn't ask me to promo their product or anything. They don't even know I'm doing this. I just really like these drum breaks. So if this is something that you're looking for and you want to check them out, the link's in the description. They're called Beat Batter. So you'll remember in the prior old school boom bap video, I talked about how the drums were typically put together in a very specific way. For instance, we would have the hi-hat be very central to the drum pattern and have a very large presence. I also mentioned about how the tools used to make beats back in the days, they were a bit more primitive, so using only a handful of drums were a better way of achieving that older aesthetic. Here with these modern boom bap beats, I think those are the two biggest difference between these two styles. We don't have that big in-your-face hi-hat. These types of drums, the hi-hats are a bit more subdued and in the back, while the kick and the snare are more in your face, so that's one difference. You will also notice I used a lot more of the different drum sounds available from this break, and I was also very deliberate with the velocity and the quantizing. I feel with these modern boom bap beats there's a bit more detail put into the drum work and more deliberation with how they're programmed. Just because the technology now makes it easier to do this. But again, that's just one side of the coin. If I were to get rid of the processing on these drums, you guys can quickly hear the difference. These drums are not very loud or present anymore. So here what I did was I layered an additional kick and snare underneath, which is always a great way to bring more presence into your drums. But I also used parallel compression. What I did was I routed my drums into this insert right here, and then I pretty much went hog wild with effects here. The biggest difference maker probably being Decapitator here. All I did was I used the drum fattener preset here to really bring more presence to the drums. I also used a transient processor. After I used Decapitator, I felt the drums got a bit too hog wild. You guys can hear how prolonged each drum sound is now. A bit too much for my liking. They take up too much room in the beat. and they ended up suffocating the beat a little bit. So using the transient processor and just bringing down the release slightly allowed me to really tighten the drums up and control them. Now when the drums are played with the rest of my beat, it just sounds a lot better. You can hear the difference this is going to make if I turn off the transient processor. The drums just become a little bit more tight and there's more space for the other elements in my beat to actually stand out and shine. And there you have it, those are the big key takeaways that you will need to know if you want to make modern boom bap beats. If you want to see how this differs from old school boom bap beats, check out that video, it should be showing up on the screen right now. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, my free drum kit's available in the description box below, as well as a link to the Discord. I do live beat reviews every so often. My beat making course is coming out really soon, so join the waitlist, you don't want to miss out on that, and I will see you guys next time.